Welcome back to our course on Excel 2013 Advanced. In this section we're going to take a look at bubble charts, which are a very special form of scatter chart. Now before we start, I should warn you a couple of things about bubble charts. They are one of the types of chart that do seem to cause people quite a few problems. And secondly, you'd only really use a bubble chart for a relatively small amount of data. Now what I mean by that will become apparent during this section. So here's the data I'm going to use. I have 6 countries: India, China, USA, Russia, Brazil, Japan, and about each of those countries I have 3 pieces of information. The information is a little bit out of date, admittedly, but for our purposes it'll be absolutely fine. I've got the population of the country, the GDP in US dollars per person, and the overall GDP of the country. What I'm going to plot first is a straightforward scatter chart. So all I'm going to do is to choose those 2 columns, the population and the GDP columns, and I'm going to do insert. I'm going to choose scatter chart. I can assume that you've drawn scatter charts before, and you have a scatter chart that plots the GDP per person along the y-axis and then the population in millions along the x-axis. And of course the 2 countries with the highest populations have actually got the lowest GDPs per person, and the GDPs are low by quite a long way. So for instance, if you look at the GDP of a person in China, you can actually hover over these points to get the figure. The GDP per person there is just $564, whereas the GDP per person up here for somebody in Japan is $37,000, so that's a heck of a big difference. Now what I want to do is to add this sort of 3rd dimension to this scatter chart, because with a bubble chart I can change the size of each of these points to reflect a 3rd variable. Now the 3rd variable I'm going to use in this case is the overall GDP of the country. So for a country with a very high GDP, it will have a bigger bubble, that's data point, than one with a low figure. And of course again the variation is quite extreme. The overall GDP of India, $324 billion. For the USA it's almost $7,000 billion, almost $7 trillion. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to get rid of that scatter chart, and now I select just the data for these 3 different values. Now on the insert menu I go back to the same menu here, but I'm going to use a 3D bubble chart, and what you see, let me just enlarge it a little bit. And what you see now is the 3D bubble chart, where not only do you have the population in millions along here and the GDP per person up here, but the size of each of the bubbles reflects the GDP overall of the country concerned. So for instance here, for Japan it has a higher GDP per person than the USA, but the USA's GDP overall is itself much higher, partly because it's got a much bigger population. You can also see here that we have 2 bubbles that overlap each other, so the ones for Russia and Brazil overlap, and here we have India and China. Now there are a couple of things about bubble charts just to tell you. One of the 2 of the things that cause people problems. When I created this particular bubble chart, let me just move this out of the way for just a moment. When I created this particular bubble chart, I didn't select the headings, I just selected the numbers. And you can select the headings, but if the top left hand one is selected, sometimes strange things happen. So if you deleted that one, the one that's currently in C2, and selected the other headings, then it would probably work okay, but it wouldn't really gain you much, because in the end with a bubble chart you have to do quite a bit of the presentational formatting yourself, as you'll see in just a moment. But that's one of the things that causes people trouble. They select all the headings, they select all the data, strange things happen in the chart. If you just select the numbers, in this case 3 columns of numbers, at least the chart itself will probably be right, and then you can do some work on the formatting side of things. So let's look at some of that work on the formatting side of things. First of all, we have this rather strange situation here where the GDP per person is becoming negative down here, and you may think, well, why has it done that? The reason it's done that is that in drawing these bubbles of a certain size, as you can see here, for example, with the China bubble, it's gone below the horizontal axis. So Excel has taken it upon itself to draw some negative values for the vertical scale. Now, you can correct that manually. You could change the position of that scale and so on. I'm going to leave it as it is for now. But that's an example of the sort of confusing thing that Excel can do for you. But let's look at doing a bit of this formatting. Chart title is pretty straightforward. We can just click in there as normal, put in our own chart title. And we can also, of course, label the axes if we want to. In terms of the bubbles, if I select a bubble, right click on it and click on Format Data Series, we get a panel on the right, and note that the data series really relates to the bubbles. Now let's talk about a couple of things in relation to these bubbles. First of all, we can set it so that the value of this third variable is represented either by the area of the bubble or by the width of the bubble. I almost always use area of bubbles, and that's the default setting normally. So basically it's not how wide a bubble is, it's the area of the bubble that reflects the value in that third variable. And also, if you find that your bubbles are a bit too big or a bit too small and it's all a bit overwhelming or underwhelming, you can put in a percentage figure here that will change the scaling of the size of those bubbles. So I've set that to 80%, which means that I actually probably just about can see that there are 2 bubbles there, one of them sticking out the side of the other, for example. So you can scale the bubble size like that. The bubble series here is known as Series 1. If I just click on the series options here in the pane on the right, Series 1 reflects the size of the bubbles. The vertical axis series is the GDP per person, and the horizontal axis series is the population size, and I could go in and work on either scaling those, changing the axes, etc. Let's stick with Series 1, which is the bubbles themselves. I can also choose, for example, how I want them filled. If I don't like the colour, I can just click on Fill Colour, choose a different colour. Let's try that one. And I can also vary the transparency. So in particular, if I wanted to be able to see through the bubbles a little bit, perhaps if they were overlapping a little bit, I could set the transparency %. And again, if I just click away there, you can now see more easily that there are 2 bubbles there. I can also adjust the border, and I can also apply effects, shadow, glow, soft edges, 3D format, etc. If I wanted to add labels to these bubbles, bear in mind that I've used the numbers to build the chart, but I haven't, for example, got the country names stored anywhere within the data that's being used for this bubble chart. If I just select, say, one of them, right click and say Add Data Label, one of the options is to add a data callout. What happens when Excel adds a data callout is that it adds a little callout like that, and it puts in the 3 numbers that it thinks I may want to show in there. So it's put in there the population size in millions, the GDP per person, and the total GDP in billions for the country. If I click inside that data label, I could actually edit it in the usual way. I could delete all 3 of those potential labels and type in instead Japan. I can move that around, I can format the text in it, colour it in and so on, and in that way I could label each of the bubbles in whatever way that I wanted to. Now I know that involves quite a bit of manual effort, but if you're doing this for a presentation, once you're used to doing it, it's a pretty quick job to do. And just before we leave bubble charts, just one thing to mention, don't forget that you have a gallery of bubble chart styles that you can access here. So if you wanted to make this a little bit flashier like that, that would be fine. And you can then of course change color schemes, backgrounds, etc. So you can achieve a pretty smart looking bubble chart without too much effort once you're used to doing it. So that is the last of the sections on the more advanced and unusual types of chart in Excel 2013 that are in general use. But we've still got some more work on charts to do, and over the next 2 or 3 sections we're going to be looking at specific types of charts, including sparklines and pivot charts. So please join me for those.